everybody. Thanks for participating, for joining. My name is Pablo Bortz, and this is the second this is the second webinar in a series of 3, which was organized together with we organized together with Engelbert Stonhammer and Florencia Medici. This series is motivated, stimulated by the Post-Keynesian Economic Society with the aim of strengthening networks of Post-Keynesian and like-minded people and scholars across the globe. The specific context is that with the support of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society, we are organizing the launching and the creation of the Argentine Post-Keynesian Association, or Asociación Post-Keynesiana Argentina, together with Florencia. And this series of webinars deals with what can Post-Keynesian economics and similar and aching traditions in economic thought contribute to the understanding of developing countries. We had the first webinar a couple of weeks ago with me and Anina Kaltenbrunner, and you can find the recording in the same link. Actually, I will put the link there in the chat. Let me hold on to 2. I will put it again. In this opportunity, we have the pleasure to present on the first hand Martín Abeles. Martín Abeles is from ECLAC. He's the director of the ECLAC office in Buenos Aires, and also he teaches at the Master on Economic Development at the University of San Martin. He got his PhD from the New School. You can always say you got it from the New School when you actually got it. It's presentation card. We also have the pleasure of inviting and thankfully accepting Sara Stevano. Sara teaches at SOAS. She got her degree from SOAS, her PhD degree from SOAS. She's a development and feminist political economist. She held teaching and research positions at the University of West of England and at King's College London. Her areas of studies are the political economy of labor, food, and social reproduction. The scheme, the plan for this webinar is first to have Martín doing a presentation of around 20 minutes, and then for Sara to present in around the same time. Both presentations will be recorded, but not the round of questions after the presentation. We will have a round of questions after each of them, after both presentations are finished, that I will moderate. I ask everybody else to close their microphones so that there be no interruption, and I will do the same here. Martín, if you can upload your slides, and I will tell you when it's about 5 minutes to finish. And you can start whenever you want there.
Can you see the presentation there?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Pablo and Engelbert and Florencia for the invitation. And thank you in the name of everyone for taking this militant time to organize this kind of gatherings and sustaining this type of organizations. I will be presenting joint work with Martín Czerkaski and Matthias Torczynski-Landau, which will be shortly published by Network Ideas. Or I will be presenting part of that work, actually, which will be published with a very similar title as the one you can see here. The goal of this presentation is to describe and to analyze the economic impact of COVID in South American countries. These are countries specialized in the production and export of primary commodities and very much integrated in financial terms to the rest of the world. Probably the most financially integrated region among other developing regions in the world. This is important for the later discussion. The purpose of the presentation is to a large extent informative, as there are people which are not from the region, but also maybe to reflect on the conditions of the necessity of structural change in South America and the conditions of possibility of such a structural change. All of this, even if it's very much a macro-applied work, pursued from the perspective of structuralist Keynesian economics, we hope. Of course, even if much of what we'll do here is part of the work that it's been published and produced by ECLAC, the usual disclaimer applies. Whatever I say here is my opinion alone and maybe of my co-authors, but not ECLAC's opinions. The presentation will be divided in 3 parts, very schematically. First part on the situation prior to COVID, COVID's impact proper in South American economies, and what to expect after COVID, to the extent that we can speculate about that, since we are still in the middle of this crisis, right? So let me go to the pre-COVID situation, and please, Pablo, let me know when I have 5 minutes left, so I can use 10. No, kidding, but let me know.
Yes, I will tell you.
So some of you may already know this, but it is good to start from here. South American economies, on average, experienced or had been experienced low and decelerating growth since roughly 2014 and to the very moment before the COVID crisis emerged. From an average growth rate of almost 5% in 2013, GDP growth fell to minus 2.6% in 2019, and before COVID was on the horizon, from ECLAC, we expected a meager 1.3 growth in 2020. Of course, things were much worse afterwards. Here in the graph, you can see the average growth rate for the commodity boom period of 2004-08 of 6.2%, compared to the roughly 0 growth rate of the 2014-19 period. And this abrupt deceleration is not only due to there being some very badly performing economies within this group of South American countries. Even if one excluded Venezuela from the grouping, one would get a deceleration of 5.7% growth in the first period to only 1.9% growth in the second period. And also, if one excluded Argentina and Brazil, during this period, Argentina and Brazil performed very poorly. Brazil, for example, underwent one of its worst recessions in decades in the years 2015-16, and Argentina kind of stagnated throughout. Even if excluding these 3 countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, the growth rate of South American, of the remaining South American countries, fell from 5.7 to less than half, 2.7%. And among this remaining group are the best performers in the region, Bolivia and Paraguay, which are the smallest economies. And if we leave those economies out of the sample, growth in the latest period was only 2.1%, barely above population growth. And these are the so-called well-behaved economies, as the IMF used to call them. I'm not sure they still call them like that, meaning that most of the economies that on average grew only 2% for those 6 years have full-fledged inflation targeting regimes, which implies, of course, independent central banks, open capital accounts, flexible exchange rates, and so on and so forth. So these growth rates looked meager before COVID, also when compared, of course, to other developing regions. Of course, this came together with growing unemployment rates, growing or stagnant inequality and poverty rates, and falling investment rates, which fell from close to 23% of GDP to roughly about 20% prior to COVID. And this is the case in all economies, including the well-behaved ones, although maybe from a slightly higher position in that case. So this is the situation prior to COVID. And why so? Why did this happen? This, of course, again, would be very schematic, but one could portray an orthodox explanation and a, say, structurization explanation. The orthodox explanation focuses on institutional weaknesses. I'm not going to go too much into that, but basically the lack of depth in financial markets, with the probable exception of Chile, the persistence of distortive taxes, the persistence of labor market regulations in some places, the maybe outsized social protection schemes. Whatever the factor, whatever the reason, the story goes, this creates some kind of necessary uncertainty as to the appropriability of investment, which reduces potential investment, reduces potential capital inflows, which of course understood as a panacea for development, and do not allow for an efficient allocation of resources. This is pretty much the orthodox view, and one must add to that this is put forth in, say, a period or after close to 30 years of market reforms, very much in line with what we used to call the Washington Consensus. So those market reforms were put in place almost everywhere, but institutions are not quite ripe for them to perform properly. And that's why the region does not really grow unless there's a commodity boom, of course. We believe that a structuralist Keynesian interpretation of what we just saw of this sharp deceleration makes much more sense, and most importantly, it may inform a much more progressive reform agenda that the one inspired in the Washington Consensus or second or third wave reforms related to that. And why do we say so? And why is that related to the infamous foreign sector constraint? Take a look at exports in South America. These figures are most of the figures that exclude Venezuela, who is undergoing a very particular situation. Exports decelerated very harshly between the 04-08 period and the most recent period prior to COVID, as measured in constant prices. This does not include, commodity prices. This is pure quantity measure. And of course, this happened everywhere. But when one compares this fall in export performance in South America, it is much harsh or much poorer than what happened around the world. So this difference between falling exports in South America and falling global trade hints to the probable reduction of export elasticities in the region, which is a structural feature which we have found consistently across the region. Every single country in South America, with the sole exception of Paraguay, so its export elasticities, so their export elasticities fall between, say, 07, 08, and the most recent estimate. And as you know from, I'm sure everyone here is acquainted with Thirlwell's law. Even if we don't interpret Thirlwell's law as an attractor or as an equilibrium benchmark, it very much affects your potential for growth in the medium to long term. And the fact that export elasticities are falling in such a manner in 9 out of 10 of or 8 out of 9 South American countries is very telling. In parallel to this, we have the so-called process of primarization. Between the early years of the 21st century and the last estimate shown in this graph, the weight of primary exports, including this manufactured primary export, but basically natural resource related exports in the region grew significantly. Pablo told me, please show something about the real economy in your presentation. We want to relate macro to the real economy, and this could be called Raúl Prevish's cross. So you have an increase in the weight of your primary exports in total exports and a reduction of your world income elasticity to exports. And of course, this sooner or later will force you to or will affect your growth rate. So this on the real side. What about the financial side? In the same period, external debt, private and public, in these countries grew significantly from, say, as shown here, 26% of GDP. This is only external debt, to close to 50% of GDP prior to the emergence of COVID. Note, by the way, although I don't want to go into too much detail, how the current account deficits did not fall as much as one would expect with such low growth performance as shown at the beginning. And this is partly due to the stock flow dynamics related to foreign indebtedness. If one wanted to be more consistent, one should show external debt as compared to exports. And here again we see a significant increase. This is actually the solvency indicator we tend to use, external debt vis-a-vis exports. And while at the beginning of the past decade, you needed 1 year worth of exports to fill your external debt or to cover your external debt, that ratio doubled by the end of the last decade. So that is again very telling as to the foreign vulnerability and the foreign vulnerabilities that affected most of South American countries across the board. So I'm gonna skip this one. This is just a summary. It shows that between 07, 08, and 18, 19, between the year prior to the international financial crisis and the years prior to the COVID crisis, both external indebtedness measured as in terms of as a percentage of exports, and the primarization measured in terms of the proportion of primary exports to total exports tended to increase in almost every country in the region. So how can you deal, and we haven't been hit by COVID yet, how can you deal with decelerating exports and growing foreign indebtedness? Well, if you do not change your productive structure, if you don't change your institutional or financial or institutional structure, well, you can slow down growth, you can accommodate a more regressive income distribution, or do not allow for further inclusiveness or closure or reduction of income inequalities, or you can do a combination of both, as was pretty much the case in many of the countries that we've been analyzing.
5 minutes.
This type of I will have to rush afterwards, but this was the longest part anyway. So, well, just to close this pre-COVID characterization, one could say that what was close to what some people have called, some scholars and very renowned ones, by the way, have called low-level equilibrium traps. You are what you began to see that before COVID emerged, and some people call that a middle income trap, and one could also call it maybe a neoliberal trap, but we'll go that at the beginning. So it is against this backdrop that COVID hits the region, and this region, South America, just as the rest of Latin America, was among the hardest hit regions in the world, or at least in the developing world. Not only in economic terms, here we see the average fall in GDP of 6.6%, with Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru outstanding in the negative performance, but also in sanitary terms, holding 5% of the world's population. South American countries report 20% of the death toll due to COVID. So why so hard? Why did it hit so hard? I'm going to really run through this. Of course, it affected unemployment, of course, poverty. Of course, why did it hit so hard? First, because things were not going well beforehand, and this was not, say, a lightning bolt in a clear sky. It was, well, when it rains, it pours, some people say. So this is one of those cases. But to be more specific, on the supply side, the flip side of the coin of primarization is a very high incidence of informality, of labor informality. These are the figures for South American countries. The problem with the type of informality that affects South American countries is that it's very much concentrated in contact-intensive sectors, which are precisely the ones that were more affected by COVID-related restrictions. Of course, informal workers, either employed or self-employed, are more difficult to reach with compensatory measures by government, etc. So that made things worse. Also, on the supply side, a relatively weak public health system in most of the countries. There are some exceptions, which of course tended to make some lockdown measures stricter, or maybe some, precautionary behavior on the part of individuals or firms even more severe. So you have these reasons from the supply side, and from the demand side. Well, from the demand side, it's important to say that this was not so much, even if an exogenous crisis, an external shock to the region. Of course, there was an episode of intense flight to quality in March, April 2020. Of course, the falling commodity prices in the first half of 2020 also affected. But overall, all those things tended to recover quickly. I'm not going to go into how many countries in the region could tap international financial markets during the rest of the year. But overall, one could say that the fall in global demand and the fall in exports was not, in most countries, the main driver of the type or the intensity of GDP fall that we saw in the previous graph. It was mostly about domestic absorption. And within domestic absorption, it was mostly about a reduction in private consumption, explained by a very drastic fall in the wage bill, explained both by real wage reductions and employment reductions. European figures are also as impressive as these ones. And also from the demand side, and one should also know that for those people who are lucky enough not to lose their jobs during the pandemic, saving rates went up to the ceiling, and this is compounded, is a compounded effect to the fall in real wages and employment. So this.
Could you round up the
Sí.
presentation?
Okay, so final point on the demand side, of course, fiscal space not so high in South American countries as in advanced countries, but that is a bit obvious. So let me go through what to expect after COVID, hopefully in 3 minutes. The increase of exports, assuming that world trade and advanced countries recover during 21 and 22, will not suffice. That is our first point. Here we estimate how much these 4 countries can expect to grow, assuming a certain rate of growth for its main trade partners, and the impact on growth will be low. Something similar happens to public spending. The multiplier, or the effect of an increasing public spending on GDP, is pretty low as compared to what one would call a Biden policy of increasing real wages, say by increasing minimum wages or some kind of progressive income policies of that sort. And this is not because of a sophisticated multiplier estimate or whatever. It is basically because the weight of private consumption is much larger in aggregate demand than both exports and public spending in most of the countries in South America. Let me skip this one and go to the conclusions, although I would like to speak about this one, but let me close it here and maybe we can go back to some other points afterwards. So what are we seeing here? That from a macro perspective, from an aggregate demand perspective, the COVID crisis hit the region very harshly, but it was largely internal, not for external reasons. In the usual sense of a balance of payment crisis, at least in most of the countries in the region. Of course, Ecuador and Argentina are a different story. They have their own crisis and prior to COVID. Global recovery will help restore some growth in the region, what will not suffice, and expansionary policies, of course, very much needed, may not suffice either, and that's why we think we need to start thinking about redistributive incomes policies, and we've been thinking about this for months now, and we're very glad to hear what's going on in the US, because this provides some room for thinking about these things in the region. But is there enough external policy space? Last graph, last sentence. This is our solvency indicator in a nutshell, and we've divided this indicator into 3 groups of countries: the agricultural countries, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay; oil countries, Colombia and Ecuador, though Colombia could also be a mining country, such as Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. So the external debt to export ratio is at a historical high, and it is at a historical high in the context of high commodity prices, with the probably exception of oil. So the external policy space to pursue the type of both fiscal policies that demanded by these times, and hopefully redistributive policies that, for different reasons, but also for aggregate demand management reasons, one would demand on these times, is not so ample. So we might have to think about, this is, I'm going to stop here, but the type of multilateral support that the region has been receiving might not be enough to recover more quickly than what the IMF is forecasting. And this forecast, of course, include a few doses of fiscal consolidation inside it. So I will leave it there, and we'll probably bring up a few points for discussion in a second round. Thank you, Pablo. And I will
Thank you.
download this thing.
Thank you. There. Thanks for your presentation and roughly fitting within the time. So now, without further delay, Sara, you can start whenever you want.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and thank you also to the entire Post-Keynesian Economic Society for this very kind invitation. I must say, as somebody who's not a post-Keynesian economist, I feel quite privileged to have this opportunity to share my work with you and be put in dialogue with you. I think it's a very nice initiative to open up this space among heterodox economists using different approaches. So I very much look forward to your comments and questions at the end. So we are shifting to a different continent. We're moving to the African continent now, and my presentation will look at production and social reproduction in a peripheral economy, which is that of Mozambique, as you can see from the map, so in Southern Africa. And I think Martín has provided sort of a high-level picture. So here we are zooming in and thinking particularly about how specific productive structures of peripheral economies are linked with the organization of work in the world of work. And we are adding social reproduction into the picture. So what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to Mozambique, and then I'm going to introduce you to the research context, in particular 2 cases that I have been working on since 2010, essentially. The cross-cutting focus is on work. And I will share with you some key aspects of labor organization that emerged from my analysis. And I will highlight the importance of looking at the imperatives of social reproduction to understand the organization of production. So I should also mention that I said that I'm not a post-Keynesian economist, but I should also say that my current work is very much informed by Marxist feminist approaches, and it's quite interdisciplinary and qualitative, so this is what you should expect from this presentation. So the overarching argument that I will try to make in this presentation is that social reproduction should not be seen as being subordinate or residual to production. In fact, I think particularly in peripheral contexts, social reproduction plays quite a shaping role in terms of both the organization of production, but also economic processes more generally. And then I want towards the end just to shed a brief light on this idea of crisis of social reproduction that many have been writing about, thinking about capitalism across the various contexts in the global north and in the global south, thinking of the implications of the crisis of social reproduction for development, which take place in multiple ways via both labor and capital. But let's start with a brief overview of Mozambique. And of course, I didn't set myself to an easy task when I chose this title for this slide. Of course, this is a country and a part of Africa with a very rich history, and I'm not going to give you all of that, of course. But I want to give you a sense of Mozambique as being a part of a macro region of Africa that Samir Amin has defined as the Africa of the labor reserves, meaning that during the colonial time, Mozambique was part of that region that supplied cheap migrant male labor to the mines in South Africa. And this is, I think, very pertinent for the south of Mozambique. In the north, due to the disconnects between the southern part of the country and the northern part of the country, actually the political economy during the colonial time was primarily structured around the forced smallholder cotton production. In the 1970s, the Frente de Libertação de Moçambique was formed between southern Tanzania and the north of Mozambique. And this movement led the country into the war for independence, which was achieved in 1975, so very recently. And Mozambique then had an early post-independence period led by the self-defined Marxist-Leninist party, Frelimo, that embraced the project of modernization, nationalization of some enterprises, and state building. But this period was very short-lived because then there was a civil war. There was this be seen in connection with the destabilization policy of apartheid South Africa. And the civil war lasted until the early 1990s and left Mozambique in a very damaged condition, both economically and socially. So in the late 1990s, Mozambique was one of the poorest countries in the world, with more than 80% of the population considered to be poor, according to the $1.90 per day poverty line. But in the late 1990s is also when, of course, in line with some broader changes that have been taking place globally, and of course, Martín mentioned the Washington Consensus before, there was a neoliberal turn and structural adjustment began in Mozambique. At the beginning, Mozambique was quite reluctant to embrace some of the liberalization policies, but then, in fact, it became to be considered a success story from a mainstream development perspective, and it attracted many donors and various actors in the mainstream development sector, if you want. Annual GDP growth remained very volatile until 2000, but then between 2000 and 2015, annual GDP growth was steadily above 6% on average. So this is in line with the narrative of the Africa Rising. Mozambique sort of embodies that idea. And during this time, it became one of the most attractive economies for foreign direct investment around particular mega projects linked to the discovery of natural resources. And I think one of the most notable ones in recent years is the discovery of a huge deposit of natural gas in the north of the country. So drawing on the work of the Mozambican economist Carlos Nuno Castelbranco, he identifies the contemporary political economy of Mozambique as being essentially structured around the three interlinked processes. The first is the maximization of inflows of FDI. So FDI play a very critical role, and they shape the Mozambican economy as an extractive economy. So this is the productive base that we're talking about. The second process is the development of linkages between foreign capital inflows and domestic capital accumulation. So here it's a context of late emergence of domestic capitalist classes that engage in this process of seeking to appropriate a surplus that is generated by these mega projects. And the third process has to do with the reproduction of a labor regime that remunerates the workers below the costs of social reproduction and or maintains people and workers as surplus labor, so in the very vast reserve army of labor. And my research so is primarily focused on this third process. In particular, what I try to do is to try to unpack some of the mechanisms through which the reproduction of such labor regime is possible, but also to question where the squeeze of social reproduction essentially becomes a point of crisis that feeds back into the overall functioning of the economy. And I just want to mention, although this is tangentially relevant to what I'm going to be talking next, that at the moment, despite these 15 years of very sustained economic growth, Mozambique has at the same time failed to reduce poverty effectively and to promote a type of socioeconomic development that is inclusive in that it benefits the majority of the population. And it is now facing as a country a number of compounded challenges, which are, I think, very critical. So one has to do with climate change. So the Mozambican territory has become very prone to cyclone activity. There is an escalating armed insurgency, in the north of the country, exactly where the natural gas deposits have been discovered in recent years. That is threatening the future of this multi-billion investment in natural gas. And then there are, of course, challenges that have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic that I don't think are in some ways very specific to Mozambique, but they have to do with some of the structural challenges that countries in the global south and peripheral economies are confronting during the COVID-19 crisis. Let's also introduce you to the research context. One case has to do with localized labor markets, so labor markets that are not connected to global production networks. Here I conducted fieldwork in the north of the country, in the province of Cabo Delgado, which is where the insurgency is going on at the moment. So the situation is very dire over there. And I've looked at both urban and rural areas with a focus primarily on women's work. So this was part of my doctoral work. But later I've also been looking at the cashew processing industry, which is quite an important industry in the country, which is export-oriented, labor-intensive and female-dominated, with fieldwork conducted both in the province of Cabo Delgado, but also in the south, in the province of Gaza. So starting with these localized labor markets in the north. So the type of image that I would like to convey is one of very high complexity. And this is in stark contrast with the image that sometimes is portrayed of, if you want, poor economies in the peripheries with, an abundance of labor and time and so forth. I think what goes on the ground is actually quite different. And so I think we need to think about these localized labor regimes as being structured around scattered pockets of export-oriented agriculture, also licit and illicit timber extraction, and mega projects, so natural gas, which we mentioned, but also ruby mining. Then there are some tourism enterprises, and then a small proportion of people, particularly in urban centers, might be employed in the public sector. But the vast majority of the population are occupied in what we can call vast localized informal labor markets. And here I'm not using informal to reflect a sort of dualistic understanding of formal and informal. I think the porosity between these two economies is actually quite key. But as a matter of fact, people mostly work and toil in the informal economies, with less than 5% of the population employed in formal occupations. And of course, in the informal economy, there is both self and wage employment, where wage employment is the type of casual, seasonal in some cases, and piecemeal wage employment. So the multiplicity of occupation is a key feature of localized labor regimes in the north of Mozambique. So people often engage in a variety of occupations to make a living, although this is not captured in official labor statistics for some reasons that if you want, I can come back to in the Q&A. And so a very widespread and common practice, instead of using earnings from one form of work to finance another form of work, and this can be done by the same person, the same individual, but also within a household or within an extended family. And this is part of the so-called processes of livelihood diversification, so which have specific historical and gender dimensions and fit into broader processes of social differentiation. So we're not talking about a sort of homogeneous peasantry, but we're talking about social and economic formations that are way more complex. And indeed, so part of the mechanisms of social differentiation is the ability of households to hire agricultural labor, which is a key class divide, if you want. And because agricultural production continues to remain very important, so access to land is a necessary, however, not sufficient condition to make a living. And this is true for both rural and urban households. So just to give you a sense of this image of complexity, and don't worry about, of course, reading everything that is written on the slide, but this comes from a survey of 120 households that I conducted in this province farms in the north of Mozambique. And it's about women's work. Very often, women are portrayed as being farmers on their family's land or their own land. And in fact, what emerges is that women, yes, they are farmers, particularly if they live in rural areas, but in fact, they are much more than that. So they work as casual wage workers in agriculture, they work as traders, they work as sort of sellers of a variety of products. And so again, the point is about this image of complexity and multiplicity of occupations. So now moving to the second case, which is instead about sort of workplace that is very much connected with, in fact, is integrated into global production networks. Is the workplace at the bottom of the global supply chain of cashew. Here, the cashew processing industry.
5 minutes it would be, eh?
Yes. Okay. Great. I'll try to do that. So we're talking about labor-intensive factories located in rural areas, about 25 factories in Mozambique, mostly owned by foreign private investors and employing around 30,000 workers, 65% of whom are women. And there is a minimum wage in the sector, which is equivalent to 54 British pounds per month that is paid to these workers. So differently from the localized labor markets, we have this connection with global production networks, but also the fact that, of course, the workers in these factories receive a monthly wage, which is something that in localized labor markets is essentially something that doesn't happen. However, it was very clear from the research that I conducted with my collaborator, Rosemina Ali, who's a researcher in Mozambique, that the wage is not enough. And indeed, there is a very perverse mechanism that essentially leads to the fact that workers are paid below the minimum wage. And this is linked to the fact that workers are paid by production targets or by number of days worked. And it is difficult for them to achieve these production targets, or even when they're paid based on number of days worked, if they cannot work every day of the month, including Sundays and what we would call in the UK bank holidays, then this is discounted from their monthly salaries. And so the minimum wages are very low, but they don't even get that. So we're talking about very poor wages and very poor working conditions, so with long working days and very weak contracts that in fact grant very few rights and obligations to both workers and employers. And that means that the workforce is incredibly fluid, with workers not necessarily going to the factory on a regular basis and so forth. And so we need to think about, even in this context, although we have a more well-defined workplace, which is different from the localized labor markets and so forth, we need to think about wage work being integrated into multiple forms of work. And factory workers are often not only factory workers, but they do other forms of course, reproductive work, but also other forms of remunerated work outside of the factory in order to make a living. And so shifting now the focus on the imperatives of social reproduction, what is a common feature in localized labor markets and in the workplace at the bottom of global supply chains is that what we have is not a neat class of proletarians, if you want, but we have classes of labor, to use this terminology put forward by Henry Bernstein, classes of labor who engage in a combination of self and wage employment, farm and non-farm work to meet the needs of an increasingly commodified life. So a life where cash is of the essence and increasingly so. And I think that this notion of classes of labor needs to be expanded, if you want, a little bit, to consider also how it is important to shed light on the mutual constitution and tension of production and reproduction. So to see how life and work cannot be really set apart. And this is where we can see that social reproduction imperatives shape the terms of engagement with remunerated work. And so I just want to give you some more concrete ideas on how this plays out. So from the research in the localized labor markets in the north, it was very clear that having housework and care responsibilities has an effect on mobility, and mobility is key to the performance of many forms of work, primarily trading, but not only. And so, for example, we see very few women, essentially no women with young children, who are able to work as traders in the north of Mozambique. But also these care responsibilities shape the frequency upon which people are able to engage in forms of remunerated work. And this is very visible when it comes to casual wage work in agriculture, where there are some clear gendered differences in this respect. Also, taking care of the sick has emerged as a key reason for long interruptions of agricultural production or engagement with other forms of remunerated work. And this is because you need to think that extended families do not necessarily live in the same place. So there is a spatial fragmentation. That means that when somebody needs to take care of an ill relative, they need to relocate to somewhere else for a certain amount of time. And that means that they might not be able to continue their agricultural production or do other forms of remunerated work. And then something that I think for me is very central in a context when we need to understand that access to social services is essentially absent, or if not absent, very minimal, that belonging to a certain community or to a social group is the only social safety net that people have. And therefore, engaging in those activities that grant you membership to a community and to a social group is absolutely fundamental. So being able to make a contribution in cash most often to ceremonies is key. And so there is this idea of the reproduction of the social that determines, for example, how some workers might decide to engage in extra work in order to have some extra earnings in order to be able to make an in-cash contributions to a ceremony. And some of these...
Could you start?
Yes. I will do. I only have one slide left. Sorry. So some of these dimensions that I have described also apply to the case of the workers in the cashew factories. But in the cashew factories, there are a couple of additional dimensions that are quite interesting. The first one is that there is a very high level of absenteeism that employers in the sector complain about all the time. And absenteeism can reach peaks of 50 to 60% of the workforce in some periods. And in our research, we've seen how absenteeism is driven by tiredness, illness, the need to engage in other forms of paid and unpaid work, the lack of money to pay for transport to go to the factory, but also the participation in funerals, which is an important ceremony, and it goes back to this idea of reproduction of the social. But also workers often quit the factory job after only a few months, and so there is a very high turnover of the workforce. And I think that the employers complain about this, but in fact, they are intentionally using this model because this allows them to keep wages below the cost of social reproduction. And so just to conclude, I think if we are to think in broader terms about social reproduction in a peripheral economy, we see how the increasing fragmentation of the means of social reproduction is particularly acute in economies with narrow and extractive productive structures. And so workers and surplus labor are sort of trapped in forms of highly precarious and exploitative dynamism. So there is a lot of this happening, but it's still, like a very precarious and exploitative. And indeed, the conditions of exploitation rest on reproducing such dynamics, such dynamism. And so the idea of the fluid workforce that is, I think, almost a business model in the cashew factories captures this idea quite aptly. And so what are the broader implications for development? I mean, why should we care about this constant and chronic squeeze on social reproduction, this chronic crisis of social reproduction that I've seen? So, of course, I think these crises have detrimental effects on labor and the productivity of labor. They're also responsible for the reproduction of inequalities, multiple inequalities, in fact, which can have indirect negative implications for economic growth and development. But also, I think that these crises of social reproduction do pose some problems for capital accumulation as well, particularly for domestic capital, if not foreign capital. So foreign capital is clearly very mobile. But because the domestic capital accumulation in Mozambique is so tightly linked to the inflow of foreign capital, this crisis of social reproduction, I think, pose some should pose some concerns also to the domestic capitalist classes. This is where I end. I just have some references, but I think they are probably redundant. But Pablo, if you want the slides, I'm happy to share them with you. So let me stop sharing. Thank you.
Great. No, thanks to you. Thanks to both for two very interesting presentations that I think actually are very complementary to each other. I admit, in my view, there is not much work by post-Keynesian economists on the topic that you talk about, Sara, but I think there is a growing engagement, I would say, in the last 20 to 30 years. I have questions and comments for